Behold now the hour of fate, long foreseen in shadow and dream, when Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, stood before the mighty gates of Angband. For many years uncounted he had pondered the final doom of Morgoth, who in the elder days was named Melkor, mightiest of the Valar before his corruption. The wind out of the north carried a dread chill, a taste of endless winter that gnawed at the hearts of all who stood upon the blasted plains. Yet in Fingolfin there burned a fire surpassing the cold of that grim region. Clad in a gleaming panoply wrought of ancient skill, he bore upon his brow the circlet of kingship, and in his hand he gripped the hilt of Ringil, the fabled sword whose blade shone with the frosty radiance of moonlit ice. With a voice that carried across the wide desolation, he struck the gates with the pommel of his sword, calling upon Morgoth to face judgment. For too long had the children of Iluvatar suffered beneath the grinding tyranny that issued from Angband's iron halls. Now, though few believed such a challenge could be met, Fingolfin came alone, resolved to challenge the dark enemy. Without flinching did he name Morgoth a coward if he would not come forth, and so there was a stirring in the dark beyond those gates, and the watchers trembled, for the greatest of evils was awakening to wrath. Morgoth rose, iron-crowned and cloaked in despair, and stepped onto the ashen field, for his pride would not suffer him to refuse such a call. There, beneath a sky bereft of light, the two stood in grim opposition. No record in song or tale could properly capture the sheer awe of that spectacle. Morgoth, once the mightiest of the Valar, loomed vast as a living mountain, the malice of ages burning in his eyes, which glowed like coals from the deepest furnaces. Fingolfin was but a single figure, an elf lord of formidable bearing, yet small against the immensity of his adversary. Still, he did not waver. The ground shook with the thunder of Morgoth's approach, but the High King's spirit burned brighter with each tremor. Soon the watchers on distant crags and fortifications saw Fingolfin raise his blade, and a cold light went forth from Ringil, causing the shadows to recoil. Morgoth laughed, a sound like mountains breaking, and lifted Grond, the mighty hammer that bore the power of countless ruined souls, naming it the Hammer of the Underworld. So their confrontation began. An echo of elder strife brought forth anew, like a final chord in the dark symphony of hatred that Morgoth had orchestrated since the first forging of Arda. Swift and valiant was Fingolfin's swordwork, for though Morgoth towered above him, the king of the Noldor had agility born of desperation and hope. Each time Grond fell, it crashed against the iron-hard ground, carving monstrous fissures and sending shards of stone hurtling through the air. The tumult was overwhelming, and the watchers beyond thought that Fingolfin could not endure more than a few heartbeats of such ruin. Yet his feet moved like the dance of flickering flames, and he evaded the crushing might of Morgoth's hammer. In answer, he sprang forward, his blade carving bright arcs through the gloom, and he dealt Morgoth 7 wounds, each cut biting into the unholy flesh that lay beneath the black armor. Morgoth bellowed in agony, and the pillars of Angband trembled with his cries. Never had he dreamed that one of the children of Iluvatar could harm him so. Each strike that drew his accursed blood was a testament to the unyielding will of Fingolfin, who fought not for personal glory, but for the freedom of his kin, driven by memories of the suffering Morgoth had inflicted upon elf and man alike. Long did their strife rage, and the dark welkin above seemed to weep ash in sorrow. Even so, there came a moment when Fingolfin's breath grew ragged and his steps slowed. For the might of Morgoth was colossal, and no elf, however noble, could stand indefinitely against that ancient power. The watchers felt despair snake into their hearts, for they believed the gallant king's doom was certain. Morgoth perceived that his foe's strength was waning, and his gloating laugh reverberated across the plains, fanning the embers of dread within all living creatures who heard it. With renewed fury, Morgoth swung Grond in a wide arc, intending to finally crush the lone warrior who had managed to wound him. And yet, as though some secret mercy or chance guided his movements, Fingolfin sprang aside in the last instant, and Grond met the earth with cataclysmic force, opening a new chasm of flaming rock. Seizing the moment, The High King lunged forth and stabbed Ringil into the foot of Morgoth, twisting the blade so that the dark enemy howled in unbridled torment, reeling from the fresh agony. Thus was the tide briefly turned once more, and the Watchers dared hope anew. In the songs that came to be sung after, it was said that Morgoth faltered, clutching his wounded foot, and Fingolfin summoned the last reserves of his fading strength. He rushed forward like a vengeful star, his spirit aflame with righteousness. But Morgoth was still, potent beyond mortal measure, and his hateful cunning flickered. As Fingolfin raised Ringil for a final blow aimed at Morgoth's black heart, the Dark Lord struck in desperation, sweeping Grond across in a crushing backhand. The blow did not find the Elf Lord squarely, but caught him enough to send him reeling. With that, Fingolfin stumbled, collapsing upon the ruined earth, and the Watchers cried out in despair. Yet the tale diverges here from what once was known in the sorrow-laden laments. For indeed, in the old account, Morgoth would then set his foot upon Fingolfin's neck, and the brave king would spend his last breath smiting the Dark Lord's flesh once more. But if fortune and hidden destiny intervened, might not the threads of fate be rewoven? Suppose that as Fingolfin fell, the earth's rent opened once more, giving him a sudden vantage. With his final ounce of vigor, he thrust upward with Ringil, driving the blade into the heart of Morgoth's being. That strike, so improbable, might just prove lethal, even to the primal might that once contended with the Valar. Thus, in the retelling of this speculative doom, Morgoth felt the kiss of death for the first time in all his dark existence. A tremor of finality coursed through his monstrous frame, and his eyes blazed with a fury born of disbelief. Never had he considered that one of the elves would have the strength or cunning to end him, even in his diminished state. Black blood gushed from the wound, searing the ground, and a howl of unimaginable anguish burst from Morgoth's throat, echoing from the towers of Thangorodrim to the farthest corners of Beleriand. It was a cry so great and terrible that the hearts of orcs and balrogs alike quailed, and even the stoic Watchers had to shield their ears, lest their courage fail. Then, in a thunderous collapse, Morgoth fell, slumping like a felled titan, and the entire fortress of Angband quaked as though it might break free of its foundations. With that titanic fall, the host of evil felt the dread knowledge that their master, the source of all their terror and dominion, was defeated. The Watchers, in turn, witnessed Fingolfin rise unsteadily, battered and bleeding, but alive. A hush of incredulity lay upon the plain, for not in the wildest dreams of any elf lord or mortal man had it been imagined that Morgoth, the prime architect of Arda's marring, could be unmade by an elven king. But so it was. Fingolfin, gasping for breath, stood victorious. The Watchers trembled with awe and relief. One by one, they emerged from behind rocks and ridges, from crevices where they had hidden, uncertain if the High King had courted sure destruction. And as Fingolfin stood, leaning upon Ringil, his armor rent and his spirit near exhaustion, there arose a cry of triumph that soared higher than any lament that had ever been voiced in those sorrowful lands. For the first time since the rising of the sun, hope kindled anew in the hearts of elves and men. The oppressive shadow that had weighed upon them for so many years seemed to lift, though the sky remained dark with clouds of ash. The grim fortress towers still loomed, but the presence animating them had been struck down. Soon the news spread like fire in dry grass. Eagles, keen of sight and swift of wing, took flight from the encircling heights, bearing tidings far across Beleriand. Morgoth was fallen, slain by the hand of Fingolfin. In the hidden strongholds of the Noldor, in the halls of men, and even in Doriath's guarded forests, the word came. Many did not believe at first, for such a thing seemed a child's fantasy. Yet as more messengers came, bearing testimony of the witness, doubt gave way to exultation. In Himring, Maedhros marveled, and the oath that weighed upon him felt a momentary slackening, for the darkest threat had at last been cut down. In Nargothrond, Finrod's heart lifted, though sorrow for the many who had perished lingered still. Even in Menegroth, where Thingol and Melian guarded their realm, there came a stirring of astonishment and a faint, cautious stirring of joy. Meanwhile, the creatures of darkness, left leaderless and bewildered, fled in chaos into the black labyrinth beneath Thangorodrim. The once unshakable heart of Morgoth's empire now trembled with uncertainty, and the faint echoes of anguish reverberated in every corridor. But the victory, mighty though it was, did not signal an end to all strife. Even in death, Morgoth's legacy was a poison coursing through the veins of the world. Balrogs still lurked within the deepest caverns, bound to the evil that first corrupted them. Orcish hordes, disorganized and prone to infighting, nevertheless remained a threat in the outskirts. Foul creatures spawned from Morgoth's dark imagination roamed the wastes. There was much work to be done, for though the tyrant was fallen, the shadow he had cast over Arda did not vanish overnight. Indeed, Fingolfin realized with weary clarity that a new labor was laid upon him, to cleanse Angband and purge Morgoth's vile dominion. Exhausted as he was, he summoned those loyal captains who had followed him from Hithlum and Mithrem, calling them forth to gather arms and unite with all who would aid them. No longer would the Noldor cower behind fortifications, but they would bring the fight into the Black Stronghold itself, liberating any captives still languishing in chains and scattering the darkness once and for all. Thus did Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, lead a host into the very maw of Morgoth's lair. Side by side with him marched elves of great valor, among them Fingon the Valiant, who had come in haste upon hearing whispered rumors of his father's bold challenge. From other quarters came men, some from Dor Lomin, determined to stand against the horrors that had once ravaged their kin. Even a contingent of dwarves from the Blue Mountains joined, drawn by ancient grudges against Morgoth and the promise of reclaiming plundered treasures. Under the light of pale torches and luminescent crystals, they entered the wide tunnels. The mood was tense, for the stench of death and decay clung to the walls, and every corner seemed to house a malevolent presence. Still, in the hearts of the vanguard burned the embers of Fingolfin's victory. With each step, they chanted quiet laments for the lost, and the echoes of their songs mingled with the drips of unseen water falling in the subterranean gloom. A great battle ensued within the halls and chasms of Angband. Orcs, maddened by the shock of their master's demise, rushed headlong into frenzied skirmishes, wielding jagged blades and cruel spears. Balrogs, fewer in number than of old but still fearsome, emerged from hidden vaults, wreathed in shadow and flame, roaring their fury at the triumphant invaders. For each terrible foe, the allied forces fought with steel and valor. Fingolfin himself, though battered, wielded Ringil, its shining edge cutting down any that would stand in his path. His presence, a beacon of hope, invigorated the hearts of those who fought alongside him. The corridors rang with the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. Yet, slowly but surely, the armies of light pressed forward, overrunning forge fires that had once churned out instruments of war, smashing altars of dark worship, and liberating thralls who had been confined in torment. Day by day, they advanced deeper, casting aside fear and forging onward in a rising tide of defiance. During one fierce engagement, Fingon and a cadre of seasoned warriors were ambushed by a nest of Balrogs. The battle was intense, the air suffused with flame and smoke. Many gallant elves perished, but in the end the Balrogs were driven into a fissure that plunged into lightless depths, from which their fiery roars could still be heard long after. Fingon bore wounds of flame and lash, yet he persevered, spurred by the knowledge that their cause was just and that Morgoth was no more. Elsewhere, dwarven craftsmen recognized some of the forging chambers, where ancient treasures of their folk had been twisted to the Dark Lord's use. They moved with grim determination, toppling grotesque forges and reclaiming shards of relics once taken in wars past. The men of Dor Lomin and other houses were bolstered by the knowledge that their mortal kin might be found among the captives. Together, in that labyrinth of anguish, their unity and courage proved an unassailable shield. The darkness within Angband felt the presence of an unstoppable tide as the intruders advanced, inch by inch, toward the seat of Morgoth's ruinous dominion. At last, Fingolfin and his main host came to the heart of the fortress, a colossal chamber carved into the roots of Thangorodrim. Here, Morgoth had once held court, a parody of the Valar's majesty enthroned upon a dais of obsidian and iron. Now the chamber lay eerily silent. Pits of molten slag glowed dully, casting flickering shadows upon twisted pillars. Foul shapes crouched in corners, hissing at the intruders, but without a master to command them, they lacked the discipline to organize a formidable defense. Fingolfin surveyed the scene, and his eyes beheld the sum of Morgoth's malice. The marred architecture, the instruments of torment scattered about, the black banners that once proclaimed his might. Weariness weighed upon the king's spirit, but he did not falter. Raising his voice, he called out for any captives to come forth without fear. Sure enough, pale figures emerged from hidden cells and half-concealed dungeons, their eyes hollow from years of torment. Elves, men, even dwarves, some who had been thought long dead, staggered forward. With gentle words, Fingolfin's people welcomed these survivors, administering what comfort they could. And so, the throne room of Morgoth was overtaken by the living, while the memory of its vile occupant lay cold upon the blasted field above. In a corner of that throne room stood a pedestal upon which rested the sundered remnants of Morgoth's iron crown. Fingolfin approached it slowly. The jagged metal still radiated a lingering aura of dread, as though some splinter of the Dark Lord's spirit clung to it. Long ago, Morgoth had invested much of his power into the dominion of Middle-earth, diminishing himself in the process. Now, with his downfall complete, only faint echoes remained. Yet those echoes were potent enough to chill the blood of mortals who drew too near. Fingolfin paused, recalling how he had beheld the crown's glint in the earlier hours of the duel. He remembered Morgoth's eyes, burning with hatred. Gently he laid a hand upon the crown, as if testing the weight of a memory. Then, with a solemn gesture, he cast it upon the floor, and dwarven hammers shattered it, scattering its shards across the flagstones. In that moment, a subtle release was felt, like a final exhalation of centuries-old malice. A hush fell upon the watchers, for they sensed that the great evil tethering Angband to its master had been severed once and for all. Following this deed, many hearts grew lighter, as though some oppressive weight had been lifted from the air. Yet sorrow for the fallen and memories of cruelty lingered like old scars. The thralls, free at last, stared in wonderment, scarcely believing they stood upon the threshold of liberty. The allied host, though victorious, bore the scars of fierce battles. Darkened corridors still led to uncharted depths where who knew what abominations might lurk. But the fortress was definitively broken. No new horrors would be fashioned under Morgoth's hand. No fresh armies would march from Angband's gates to harry the free peoples. For Fingolfin had accomplished the unthinkable, and the doom that had weighed heavily upon the Noldor now found some measure of redress. The spirit of rebellion that first led them from a man, filled with righteous anger at Morgoth's theft of the Silmarils, found a bittersweet conclusion here, in the very lair of the one who had stolen them. Once the fortress was thoroughly secured, Fingolfin gave orders for the open cleansing of all its halls and passageways. He tasked those stout of heart to explore the lower pits, ensuring that no vile enchantments or monstrous spawn could threaten the surface again. Healing wards were established near the gates, where the wounded could be tended, and the newly freed captives could find food and solace. Bards composed new lays on the spot, praising the valor of the High King and honoring the memory of those who had fallen. As the days turned to weeks, Angband was gradually emptied of its darkness. Torchlight replaced gloom, the echoes of elven voices supplanted the snarls of orcish speech, and the battered stones bore witness to the resilience of the children of Iluvatar. The once dead air stirred with the faint hope of renewal. Some even dared to speak of establishing a watch or outpost within these walls, to ensure that no remnant of Morgoth's influence might rise again. Far away, in realms untouched by the immediate strife, the rumor of Morgoth's slaying spread further. Men who had yet to cross the Blue Mountains heard of it and dared to dream that their western kin had broken the ancient evil. On the Isle of Balar, elves who had fled the earlier wars listened in astonishment. Even the Maya, who had become known as Sauron, a disciple of Morgoth, felt a tremor as the bond to his master was severed. Sauron brooded in hidden places, his cunning mind already devising new ways to impose dominion. But the fall of Morgoth was a blow that no cunning could swiftly mend, and for a time, the great foe was no more. Arda, though bruised and scarred, drew breath in relief. In the hearts of elves, men, and dwarves, an unlooked-for confidence began to grow. Perhaps the future was not doomed to endless darkness. Perhaps the joys of life could flourish without the looming threat of Morgoth's hateful gaze. In every corner of Beleriand, the watchers of that age would remark that the stars seemed a fraction brighter, and the nights a hair less oppressive. Amid this shift in the tapestry of the world, Fingolfin himself soon recognized that the mantle of high kingship was heavier than ever. The Noldor, though vindicated in their war, were now in a position of leadership and obligation. While Morgoth's twisted spirit no longer directed the forces of evil, scattered pockets of darkness would continue to haunt the land. Moreover, the Silmarils, those jewels that had once been at the heart of the strife, remained lost to the children of Feanor. Indeed, Morgoth had locked them within his iron crown, and they had long since vanished into the clutches of greater destinies. Fingolfin contemplated the burdens that still lay ahead. He had promised to protect his people and to unify the free folk in the face of any lingering threats. For though triumph had come in an hour of high romance, the tears shed for the fallen still demanded remembrance. In the aftermath, many parleyed about the future of Angband. Some argued that the fortress should be razed entirely, its foundations salted and cursed, so that none might ever dwell there again. Others advocated turning it into a citadel for the forces of light, a bulwark against any new darkness arising from the far north. In the end, Fingolfin chose a middle course. Certain outer structures could be repurposed as strongholds, but the deepest pits and vile engines would be collapsed, so that the memory of Morgoth might not fester. And thus, with concerted labor, the Allied forces brought down large sections of Angband's labyrinthine architecture. Explosions of stone and dust filled the air, burying cursed chambers beyond reach. The black smoke drifting skyward served as a final exorcism of centuries of unholy forging. High upon the ruined towers, banners of the Noldor and their allies were raised, a symbol that these halls belonged no longer to the Lord of Darkness. The watchers from afar saw those bright pennants flutter, and their hearts were stirred by the magnitude of the victory. When at last the host emerged from the gutted fortress, Fingolfin stood at the fore, clad still in rent armor, yet carrying himself with unbroken dignity. He paused to gaze upon the wide plains of Anfauglith. Once, these lands had been green, before Morgoth's ruin spread across them. Now they were a desert of ash and dust, a reminder of the bitter wars waged in the shadow of Thangorodrim. The king allowed himself a moment of sorrow for all that had been lost. Then, with a weary but firm resolve, he lifted his gaze to the watchers who awaited him. Cheering erupted, a sound that reverberated across the plain, mingling with the windy hush. Fingolfin raised his hand in silent thanks, acknowledging both the living and the spirits of the fallen. Thus ended the immediate siege of terror that Angband had cast over the hearts of the free people. Soon after, embassies came from every corner of Beleriand and beyond. The sons of Feanor arrived, their prides tempered by the knowledge that the greatest blow against Morgoth had been struck by Fingolfin. Maedhros, tall and grim, hailed his uncle's deed, conceding that fate had favored the High King in a manner unforeseen by the oath-bound Fënorians. From Nargothrond came Finrod Felagund, praising the valor of his kin with gentle words, offering aid and counsel in the days to come. From Doriath came emissaries of King Thingol, bearing cautious congratulations, for though old grievances existed between Thingol and the Noldor, the fall of Morgoth was a cause for universal relief. Mortals too sought audience. Houses of the Edain that had known only war and fleeting peace under the shadow of Angband now looked to Fingolfin as a savior figure. They offered fealty or friendship, wishing to share in the new dawn of freedom. Though Fingolfin accepted these honors graciously, he did so with humility, reminding them that Morgoth's downfall was achieved at great cost and that vigilance must remain their watchword. In the days and weeks that followed, the alliance expanded into what some saw as the seed of a grander union among the free peoples. Diplomatic ties were strengthened, trade routes opened, and new strategies were devised for scouting the remnants of Morgoth's armies. Yet Fingolfin never forgot the cost in blood and tears that had brought them here. In solemn ceremonies, the fallen were honored. Mounds were raised upon the plains, adorned with elven runes and wreaths of white flowers. Laments were sung in Quenya and Sindarin, in the tongues of men and dwarves as well, uniting each race in shared grief. Over time, those mounds grew into a hallowed place of remembrance, marking the final turning point in the War of the Jewels. Meanwhile, far above, the eagles soared, vigilant and free, their watchful eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of new evil. As the seasons turned, the land around Angband began to heal, if slowly. Ash drifted away under the cleansing rain. Hardy grasses took root and the wastelands were not so desolate as before. Still, pockets of foulness remained, and no traveler dared pass too close to the labyrinths that lay half-buried in the north. Patrols were established to keep watch, and thus was a semblance of peace fostered in Beleriand, a respite unknown since the dawn of the sun. Yet rumors persisted that Morgoth's vile influence could never be wholly erased. Some claimed that beasts of dreadful aspect still prowled the darkest tunnels, bereft of a master, yet dangerous in their own right. But for the moment, the sunrise over the plains seemed kinder and the light of the moon more serene, as though unburdened of a great oppression. There came a day when Fingolfin himself ventured to the spot where Morgoth had fallen. Though the ground was blackened, the footprints of that colossal struggle remained etched into the stone. The crater from Grond's impact had cooled into a wide scar, silent testament to the cataclysm. Fingolfin paused there, standing alone, recalling the fierce duel that had bent the very fate of the world. He felt the weight of memory pressing upon him, the sound of Grond's thunder, the agony in his own limbs, the desperate leap that brought Ringle's tip to Morgoth's heart. He closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer to Eru Iluvatar for the grace that had allowed him to prevail, and for the souls of all who had perished in ages past. Then he opened his eyes to the horizon. A subtle warmth lay in the air, the promise of a new era. With a final nod, he turned away, letting the blackened field stand as a memorial for the improbable victory that had reshaped the destiny of elves and men. In later years, minstrels would sing of this event as the moment a single elf lord challenged and slew the mightiest evil ever to blight Middle-earth. They spoke of Fingolfin's luminous courage, of Ringil's icy brilliance, of the trembling gates of Angband and the downfall of the Iron Crown. They also sang of the consequences, of how the free peoples rose to reclaim the lands that had been lost, forging a tapestry of alliances that might endure future perils. For indeed, the doom of Arda was not fully undone. Other shadows would arise, lesser in power but no less cunning. Yet, the memory of Fingolfin's stand became a beacon against the darkness, an affirmation that evil, no matter how vast, could be withstood. From that day forth, his name glowed in the annals of elves and men alike, honored not merely for his rank, but for the unquenchable fire in his heart. Thus ends the account of how Fingolfin actually defeated Morgoth at the gates of Angband, unweaving the tapestry of woe that had blanketed Beleriand. Though many details would fade into legend, the essential truth remained clear: that hope had triumphed against all odds, that courage could challenge even the darkest tyranny, and that a single warrior's resolve might shift the course of ages. In time, new generations would walk those lands, scarcely believing that once the ground trembled beneath the feet of a monstrous god-tyrant. Yet those who listened to the old songs would remember, and in remembering find a spark of valor within themselves. And so Middle-earth continued, wounded yet unbroken, forging onward toward whatever fate the future might hold. For in every twilight there is a dawn, and in every unyielding heart a flame that no darkness can extinguish.